Ducks fans, are you ready? You are listening to the Ducks and Pucks podcast. This is the #1 home for Anaheim Ducks talk and analysis. Here we go.
Welcome to the show. This host Mike Walters, and I'm back with Thomas Harrington. We talked about the trade deadline before it happened, obviously, and now we're going to kind of recap it. Thanks for coming back on the show, Thomas.
Happy to be here. Just call me the ebook for the podcast.
That's right. Yeah, Eddie's been a little bit busy, got a lot of things going on, so Thomas has been doing an excellent job filling in. He also does a great job covering the minor league stuff for the Ducks, especially during the summertime, and also the goals during the regular season. So we're going to kind of go back to what Thomas and I talked about. Some things worked out that we discussed, and some things didn't. So let's talk about the trade deadline. There were some moves. We'll also talk about Verbeek and his Ducks migration event that I went to, and talking about the deadline as well and the future of the Ducks. But let's get to the deadline. Let's get right to it. I guess the one thing that you and I discussed that we were happy about is that Henry Thrun did get traded. He went to San Jose for a third-round pick. You and I talked about it in the last show. We had hoped that we would get something instead of nothing, and this one did work out, Thomas. I was extremely happy that Verbeek was able to do something with him.
Yeah, I mean, Henry Thrun, I think, is a great prospect. I think he's been, I've had him in the Ducks' top 10 prospect for the last several years. I was disappointed when I heard he wasn't going to sign, but I also really appreciate that he did tell the Ducks, hey, I'm not going to sign with you. So he gave them a chance to get some value for him still. And getting a third-round pick, I mean, you take a fourth-round pick and make it a third-round pick, he'll take that every day of the week. And, San Jose's got a very good prospect. If they get him to sign, I think they're going to be very happy with him. For the Ducks, they've got a third-round pick in 2024 from a team, like, to be honest, the Sharks next year, probably not going to be great. So that should not be that should be what? Maybe in the mid-60s, maybe low 70s for a third-round pick. That's pretty good. I'll take that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were talking about it. You had talked about, too, on the last show that, hey, they had till mid-August to figure this out. They could have traded him, after the deadline, too. We talked about maybe him being part of a deal. That didn't happen, but they still traded him. They got a third-round pick, like you said, a step up from a fourth-round pick. So I was extremely happy for this. I felt like this was a win. And then we talked about the defense. We talked about Klingberg needing to be traded. If that didn't happen, it would have been a big L for the Ducks. We also talked about Kulikov and Shattenkirk, and we predicted that Klingberg would be traded and then Kulikov or Shattenkirk, and then it was Kulikov that went. So we ended up, we did okay there too as well. What did you think about the Kulikov trade? He went to Pittsburgh. They got Brock McGinn. They got a third-round pick in 2024, and then they had to retain 50% of his salary. What did you think about that deal, Thomas?
So, like we said at the time, the Ducks, they've been bad this year. Kulikov hasn't been great. He didn't have a lot of value, so getting a third-round pick for him, I think, is actually pretty good. Pittsburgh was trying to get out of Brock McGinn's salary. They had waived him, I think it was the week before the deadline. No one claimed him, so they wanted to get rid of that contract. So it's not surprising that he was included in the deal. He's not a great player, let's be honest. He's miscast on the Ducks top line right now, even though he has scored a goal. He's a useful player for your third and fourth line, and every team needs players like that. He signed for, a relatively reasonable number, especially for a team that's not near the cap for the next couple of seasons. So hopefully he's a good player. Hopefully that third round pick works out. But here's the thing. We got Kulikov for essentially free. So to me, even just a seventh round pick for Kulikov is a win in my book. And we got substantially more than that.
Yeah, I think this deal worked out for both teams. Because like you mentioned, the Penguins had sent McGinn down looking to, assign him to the AHL. They cleared cap space. That deal gets sent to, him and his contract gets sent to the Ducks. They bring in Kulikov to help their defense. They only pay half of that. They give up a third-round pick. It seemed to kind of even out. I know Verbeek was happy with McGinn. It seems like his theme, and we'll get into it a little bit later in the show, but he's trying to get more players that go to the net, a little bit more energy in their game. With McGinn, he's also a good penalty killer. So, it seems like he kind of had his eye on this guy, and he also made a deal too. So, this trade, I don't really know if anybody won or lost it. It's hard to say that. I know Thomas and I talk about that too when we post little articles and stuff when trades happen about, a lot of people want to assign a grade or they want to say who won or lost. I don't know if anybody really won or lost this trade. I think it came out pretty even. They also got McGinn for 2 years as well, Thomas.
Yeah, it's a pretty fair trade both ways. It's not a huge trade for either team. It's not going to tip the needle significantly, I think. The Pens got a little older. A lot of people a lot of fans on there, and I remember actually questioned this deal, like, why are we getting Kulikov? We have so many defensemen, we don't need him. But hey, the Ducks were able to just in that free agent free agent defenseman, they got a 3rd round pick. I'm pretty happy with it. Pittsburgh, they've got more depth through the playoffs on their back end, and that's never a bad thing. We've seen injuries happen. There was that 1 year several years ago for the Ducks where I think like 5, maybe all 6 of their regulars were injured at some point early in the season. So depth is never a bad thing on the team's blue line.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it seems pretty even, like you said. And we were able to get picks. That was kind of something that Verbeek was looking at too. He ends up getting a pick with Thrun. He gets a pick with Kulikov. He then gets a pick with Klingberg. This trade with Klingberg, I don't know. This one was kind of interesting. It went down to the wire, a trade deadline. We knew the other moves were made. There were some minor deals made with Chicago as well. And then finally the Klingberg one came through. I was almost laughing because I was thinking about you, Thomas. I thought, oh my God, if they don't trade Klingberg, this is going to be a big, big L because we talked about it last show. And then it comes through. He goes to Minnesota. The Ducks get a 4th round pick in 2024. Schuster comes back. He's been with the Ducks a couple times, and then they get the rights to Nikita Nesterenko. I don't know. This one I had mixed feelings. Obviously in the beginning of the season, it was like, okay, we got Klingberg. We're going to get a 1st round pick and flip him at the draft, at the trade deadline. As the season went along, it was like, okay, well, maybe we'll get a 2nd. And then it was like, okay, maybe we'll get a 3rd. And then to see him go for a 4th, I was kind of frustrated. I mean, they did get other parts of this as well. Verbeek talked about this deal, and it was done in the final, 2 minutes before the buzzer, basically. He snuck that deal in there. I don't know. This one was a little bit frustrating. I mean, I'm glad it went through, but I almost wish they maybe would have got a 3rd round pick. I don't think Schuster, I don't know, adding some more depth to Ducks blue line, Drysdale's out, Vakanainen's out, okay, but I don't know. I don't know. This one just doesn't set 100% right with me, Thomas.
Yeah, I was definitely disappointed when I first heard about this deal. The 4th round pick is the real big disappointment. Like you said, we dreamed of a 1st round pick in the summer. Then that dream was maybe a couple 2nd round picks, even just one. Leading up to the deadline, it was like, okay, maybe a 3rd we can get, maybe a 2nd and a 3rd. So that 4th feels like settling, but at the same time, I just can't be surprised by it because Klingberg has been bad. He did not work well for the Ducks this season. He's supposed to be a power play specialist, and he lost that spot to Cam Fowler. And I love Fowler, but no offense to him. Klingberg should have been on the number 1 unit, but Fowler was better this year than he was. He deserved that spot. He earned that spot, and Klingberg didn't just never did anything to get that back. And if he's not on your power play, he's a liability defensively. And on a team that is everyone's liability defensively, he really stood out as being bad. So his value just decreased so much. I was hoping, his offense had started to pick up in recent weeks. Maybe that would help increase the value, but I really get why no one wanted to risk it. Like, if this was how bad Klingberg was coming to a new team, do you want to really risk that when he's going to come to another new team right before the playoffs? So I get why that value was so low. To me, the big thing for the Ducks is Nesterenko. He is a college player. He's going to be a free agent. So the key is getting him signed. If the Ducks can get him signed, this deal isn't a win, but it's a potential win down the road. The Athletic recently graded everyone's prospect pool in the NHL, and they said Minnesota's was the best system, period. Now, Nesterenko was not one of their top prospects. He wasn't even one of their top 15 prospects. He was like he just the cuff. He's probably their 16th or 17th best prospect. That's not great. But if if you are the best prospect system and you're the 16th, 17th best prospect on a number of other teams, you're probably among their top 10 prospects. So this is not a throw-in scrub who's never going to do anything. I mean, that could happen in terms of the NHL future, but he actually does have some skill. Get him signed, get him to the goals next year. Let's see what he does. And, if this deal really is just an AHL player and a fourth-round pick, with how Klingberg played this year, that was his value. So that's what we got.
Yeah, I was just a little frustrated. I felt like if they could have got at least a third out of it, I would have been a little bit happier. But I am curious to see about Nestorenko. It seems like Verbeek's big on him. He's had 73 points in 93 games in 3 years at Boston College. He had 11 goals last season in 32 games. Size is decent. He's 6'2", 183 pounds. Again, that theme of, he goes to the net. It seems like that's what Verbeek wants is more size and people going to the net. The only knock on him I've seen is that he's more of a pass-first type player. But I'm very curious to see what happens with him and what happens. But, I mean, I am glad that a trade was made because I have to tell you, Thomas, when it got almost to noon Pacific time, I seriously almost text you. I'm like, man, they are not going to trade Klingberg. And we had talked about it on the show before, and I'm like, man, if they don't do this, it's going to be a huge, L for the Ducks. But I am glad they made it. What did you think? I know you kind of touched on this. What did you think about how the Ducks managed him on ice? You mentioned Fowler. He was more of the quarterback on the power play this year. Do you think there's anything the Ducks could have done differently with his on-ice time to maybe get him to be a higher pick at the trade deadline, or what do you think?
I think they could have tried putting it back onto the power play, after Christmas, after the New Year type thing. But, he hasn't been very good, so I get why they didn't from a coaching perspective. And one thing I do appreciate about Verbeek, or at least the impression I get from him, is he's going to let Aikens coach and not tell him what to do with his lineup. So I do appreciate that because the GM should not be doing that. But I also wish Aikens had played him a little more on the power play to try and up his value. But again, with how bad he's been this year, I get why he was on the second unit. It's unfortunate. And the coach's job is to win the game in front of them. The GM's job is to give the coach the best lineup he can. But then lets the coach do what he wants with the lineup. And if Klingberg was not playing good enough to be on the first power play unit, or to be getting top pairing minutes, or what have you, then he's not playing good enough, and the coach shouldn't put him in that situation. Even though I wish Aikens would have, just to try and bump his numbers up a little bit to try and get a third-round pick. But I can't be mad at Verbeek for not interfering with the coach, and I can't be mad at the coach for trying to win the games with the best lineup he thinks is possible.
Yeah, that's a good point you bring up, and I'll talk about that a little bit more when I talk about when Verbeek did the Q&A with Niedermayer. He kind of talked about that, and I thought it was interesting, but I'll kind of hold that off. Just real quick, just remind everybody we're part of the Old City Sports Network. One of our sponsors is Norse Beards. Go to norsebeards.com for our grooming needs and enter the code OCS for a 25% discount. So the Ducks made these trades. These were kind of the bigger ones, if you'll say. I mean, they didn't make like a huge trade, but these were the ones that we had talked about. Thomas and I went over the last show, and we were like, hey, these are the ones that they should try to do. They also did make some smaller trades. They did a lot of stuff with Chicago and their AHL team. Maybe surprising, I don't know, but they ended up sending Austin Strand to Chicago for Chase Perinsky, Maxim Golod for Dylan Sakura, and then Grimaldi and Nyhoff for future considerations, which is Eddie's favorite player. But what did you think about all these trades? It seemed like the kind of reoccurring theme for Verbeek was getting guys with more offensive upside. But what did you think? You definitely cover the goals and the prospects much better than I do. What was your take on some of these moves with Chicago?
So first, the Strand Prischke one, it surprised me. Lots of minor leagues deals like this happen. He's only played one game for the goals, and he had 2 goals, and I think including the game winner in overtime. So Prischke's early return, pretty good. I'll take it. We'll see how that goes. But I'm kind of neutral on that deal, I would say. the goalie for Sakura. Is that how you say it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I want to say Sakura because of Peter back in the day.
Right.
I actually like that deal a lot because Gold was signed as a undrafted free agent a few years ago, and he has spent since then more time in the ECHL than the AHL. He's actually been pretty good in the ECHL. I think about a point per game player this year, but just doing nothing in the AHL. So you're actually getting a player who can score at the AHL level and even has a couple of NHL games under his belt. It's a very small, very minor deal, but I actually really like that move. Again, it's not one that's going to tip the needle, but you're getting a better player, frankly, for a worse one in my mind. So that move I actually like. The Grimaldi deal, he was signed to an AHL only contract, so the Ducks technically had no control over him. Same with Nyhoff. And, I'm going to miss Grimaldi. He has been far and away the Eagles' best forward this year. He is, I would argue, their second best player overall behind only Dostal. And he's an exciting player to watch. In a season of awfulness for the goals, he was one of the reasons to watch their games. He was a lot of fun to watch. I'm going to miss him. I really think he deserves an NHL contract next season. I hope someone gives it to him. I would be very happy for the Ducks if I don't think it's going to be, but I think he's earned the NHL deal. He's among the top scorers in the AHL this season. He was a lot of fun to watch, and I will miss that. But he's also going to a team that has a shot at the playoffs, unlike the Goals, so I'm glad he's going to get that chance.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think Perinsky and Sakura, they can add a little bit more for the Ducks offensively, like you talked about. I am kind of bummed about Grimaldi. He seemed like a fan favorite. They even had his wife singing the national anthem at a Goals game. I was a little surprised about that, and then I cracked up when I saw future considerations because you and I talked about it before the show, and it's like it's one of the few things in the NHL that I feel like's not really defined that well. It can be, any kind of picks or anything. There's no real time limit to it. I don't know. It's just kind of funny, and I know Eddie cracks up with the whole future considerations thing. So I'm not gonna lie, I was a little bit bummed to see him go. The other ones, kind of make sense. As you talked about, they're not going to push the needle, so to speak. But Verbeek ended up making some of these trades with Chicago, and so there were some more little deals like that. But the overall feeling, it seemed like to me, a lot of people were really not happy with the trade deadline. They felt like other things could have been done. You and I talked about possibly Comtois being traded. We talked about Grant. We talked about Henrique on the last show as far as the forwards. In the goalie situation, we talked about Gibson. We talked about Stolars. And part of this is we found out after the trade deadline that there were significant injuries. And you and I did touch on those on the last show. And of course, we didn't know the extent of these, but we found out that Stolars is gone for the rest of the season. Vakanainen had hip surgery. He is gone for 5 to 6 months. And then Henrique as well is out. He was injured, I want to say February 21st was the date that they said, 5 or 6 weeks. So, that takes you almost to the end of the season anyways. So that was a factor, unfortunately, I think, in the trade deadline and why some stuff didn't come to fruition. Like we talked about, the Ducks made the moves defensively that we thought they would. They did not make them on the forward and in net like we thought maybe they would have done. So to me, I get the frustration from the fans, and I was a little frustrated too. But these injuries definitely played a factor in limiting what Verbeek could do at the trade deadline. Thomas.
Oh yeah, definitely. I feel bad for Stolars. Like, he's out for the season. He's missed a ton of time this year. Who knows what he's going to get for next year? I hope he finds a backup job somewhere. Probably won't be with the Ducks, but we'll see what happens this summer. Henrique being out for the season. There was that memo that went out to NHL teams right before the deadline that said something like, they're going to really scrutinize deals of trades for injured players, so you can't just reactivate them as soon as the playoffs start to avoid the cap. And I think that might be one of the reasons why Henrique wasn't moved, because if he's back as the playoffs start, you're going to get a very good player for this playoff run and then next year as well. But if the NHL is going to say no to that deal because he's going to be injured until that point, well, that kind of kills any interest in a possible deal that he might have had. So that injury was unfortunate on just so many levels.
Yeah,
actually,
go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I also think the other issue for the Ducks was the Klingberg deal taking so long and being done at 11:58 a.m. I feel like because Verbeek was focused on that so much, he couldn't do other things. Because I'm actually, I won't say I'm happy, but I'm given the value of the players traded, I'm relatively satisfied with the return. But what I wanted to see was Verbeek be a third party destination in a large trade to get an extra pick, or to take back a bad contract to get an extra pick. And he tried that last year with the Donov when what turned out we were on his no trade list, so that didn't work. I wanted more trades like that. And unfortunately, I think because the Klingberg thing went down to the wire and took so much time and effort is why he wasn't in on other things. But the good news to me is he actually still did get Klingberg traded. This wasn't a situation in Philadelphia where they tried to trade JVR and it didn't materialize. When you're a team who's not going to make the playoffs, you have a good player who will be a free agent this summer, you really need to get a return. Now, the Ducks have some free agents who didn't trade. Grant is one, but again, like we talked about, he's missed so much time this year. He essentially had no market value. And it's more value for the Ducks to keep him to help them through the rest of the season. Philadelphia really should have traded JVR. Even though it's just a fifth-round pick, it still has some value. So at least that didn't happen for the Ducks with Klingberg and with Kulikov. They did get value. They weren't stuck just holding them after the fact. So satisfied-ish, I think is the best way to put it. But the thing that I'm most upset with is what didn't happen, what they could have done if that didn't take so long to get done.
Yeah, it's a good point that you bring up. I mean, he said Verbeek talked about spending an hour on the phone with Minnesota haggling, trying to get the Klingberg deal done, and it did get done, obviously. And like you said, it happened, and that was a thing that you and I said was a must. But you're right. He spent all that time from must have been around 11 o'clock till almost noon Pacific doing that, and he could have missed out on some other stuff. And I'm with you too. I think part of the issue was, trying to trade Grant. I don't know what kind of value there was. There was probably very, very low, 6th, 7th round pick. So he probably said, screw it, I don't want to do that. Comtois too, maybe not really a high value for him as well. So he couldn't do anything. And I forgot about that. You brought up a good point about that memo they put out, which I thought was interesting. I don't remember the league ever putting out something about trading for injured players before the trade deadline.
I mean, Tampa's done it. Chicago's done it. A lot of teams have done it to help win the cup or get very close to the cup. So it felt very weird they did it this year. And I don't think that's the only reason why Henrik wasn't traded, but I do think it impacted the market for him. And if there's not a market, there's no reason to trade him this year because we still have him for next season. And, for Comtois, he is a restricted free agent, so the Ducks didn't have to move him. Now, the question then becomes this summer is, do they qualify him and then try and trade him? Or, like Sam Steele, do they not give him a qualifying offer and he leaves as a free agent? We'll see what happens. I'm kind of hoping Comtois is a strong end to the regular season, so we do qualify him and then trade him at the draft or later in the summer.
Yeah, that's a good point too. You're right. He is an RFA, so there is some things that can happen with him as well. And yeah, I think that memo did affect the whole situation with Henrique and some of the other players as well. And you also touched about the being a third team broker. You and I did talk about that on the show before the trade deadline. The Ducks did that with Del Zotto earlier in the season. I was kind of curious to see if they were going to do that here. We talked about Thrun maybe being one of those in there. They ended up getting him, like we said, straight up to San Jose for the third round pick, so that worked out. But there wasn't any of that as well. The Ducks didn't take on any contracts, that had a lot of weight to their cap hit in return for some picks or anything like that. So I was a little surprised about that. I felt maybe Verbeek missed out a little bit there, Thomas.
Yeah, that's my biggest issue with the deadline. Not who they traded or what they got back, but just what Verbeek wasn't able to do. Now, is that because he couldn't find the right deal, or is it because he was tied with Klingberg, or was it another reason that we don't know about? I don't know, but I feel like that was, I don't want to say a failure, but that was the biggest missed opportunity. Like, we weren't going to go off Klingberg or Kulikov, but missing out on a free third-round pick for retaining salary in another deal, that's what is unfortunate.
Yeah, that I felt that was a missed opportunity. Well, then, after the dust settled on the trade deadline, the Ducks had their Orange Alliance event where they had Scott Niedermayer and Verbeek talk about the trade deadline and other things. They had Brian Hayward there as well, and I got to attend. So we'll kind of break that down. I did write an article on it that summarizes a lot of what happened. In the article, when you go back to look at it, it's pretty much in chronological order. I put in there, hey, this is what they talked about, and I kind of went through. Here for the show, I kind of broke it down into three groups. Kind of want to talk about the trade deadline because that's what Thomas and I started the show with. The current state of the team and then the future outlook. So we had Adam T-Town on Instagram asking, what are we doing as a team? Well, that's what Verbeek talked about at this event. He talked about going after more draft picks, and he did achieve that. He got 3 more draft picks in those deals with Thrun, Kulikov, and Klingberg. That was his strategy. And it seemed like I said, a reoccurring theme too was trying to get back players that would go to the net or provide, he said, quote, energy in the lineup. So he liked what McGinn had. He liked what Nestorenko had. He talked about Schuster, bringing him back just because the Ducks were kind of hurting on the blue line with Kulikov and Klingberg being sent out, which Thomas, you and I did talk about that in the last show. We said, well, they got to bring somebody back because they're going to send these guys out. So that was part of it too as well. And he also talked about Klingberg and said that he was trying to push himself a lot in the beginning of the season, and that's maybe why he didn't do as well as we thought he would have. But overall, as his strategy for the trade deadline, I liked his strategy. Like I said, I didn't love what happened at the deadline. I didn't hate it. I thought it was kind of the middle of the road, Thomas.
Yeah, he got what value he could for what the Ducks had, but there were definitely missed opportunities there. And it's also unfortunate he couldn't get more picks for this year's draft. But, he does have 3 second-round picks this year already, so getting some stuff in 2023 isn't the worst in the world. Sorry, in 2024 isn't the worst thing in the world. And again, especially for San Jose, they're not going to be a great team, so I'll take their 3rd-round pick. Be very happy with that.
The other big part of this I thought was very, very interesting was Gibson. He talked about this at the event. Hayward asked him straight up, hey, were you thinking about trading Gibson? And he's like, no, I wasn't thinking about trading Gibson. And then he really stressed the importance of having a number 1 goalie. He said it's hard to, to find one and to keep one, and that if you move one, you have to have another one ready to go. He talked about his time in Tampa trying to get a number 1 goalie, got Vasilevsky, and all that. The direct quote I put actually in the article, I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's actually kind of long, but it's in there. You can read it. I thought that was kind of the bombshell of the interview because you had Elliot Freeman go on Duckstream. He was like, oh yeah, I think the Ducks are, could be in the market to move Gibson. You had him on his 32 Thoughts podcast saying, oh, the Ducks and Gibson are ready to move. There was all this smoke and all this stuff about Gibson. I mean, we'd heard about this all before when Murray was a GM and then nothing happened. Now Verbeek's the GM and he addressed this directly. And I was kind of surprised. I mean, to hear him say that, though, even though he made that comment, I still think it doesn't shut the door on a trade, Thomas, because maybe Dostal's not ready yet. I don't know. There's still some games left in the season. Maybe he gives him more time and he thinks he's ready then. Maybe he has Gibson back next season and Dostal's the backup and then trades him next year. So he wasn't going to trade him at this deadline, but it doesn't mean that he won't trade him in the future.
Yeah, I agree with Verbeek. You want to keep that first round. You want to keep your starting goaltender. If you trade him, you need to have one waiting in the wings. And is Dostal that starting goaltender? I certainly like to think so. I hope so. But if he is, he's not there yet, certainly. And I don't think he'll be there at the start of next season. So to me, what would have been the ideal thing to do is last summer trade Stolarz, let Dostal be the backup this entire season. Let's really see what he's like in the NHL. That didn't happen, but with Stolarz being injured, he will be with the Ducks the rest of the way. He's going to get 7-8 games more, maybe, depending on exactly how the splits work. So that's a nice taste of the NHL for him. Next year, I fully expect him to be the backup. If he's not the backup to Gibson, I will be very, very surprised. If he's not, that means either the Ducks have made a very surprising move, or Kelly Kling has come into camp and just been phenomenal. And I don't think that's going to happen. I think Dostal will be the backup next year to Gibson. And I think depending on how Dostal plays, maybe the Ducks look to move Gibson at the deadline, but I think next summer is what's much more likely. I think summer 2024, maybe the draft in 2024 is the first time I think it makes sense to move Gibson if Dostal has progressed enough throughout next season. So it really depends on how Dostal does next year. We have to see.
Yeah, I agree with you. And we had a question from Johan Lewis that, he asked, what will the Ducks do with Gibson? They keep him this season. I think that you're right. I mean, they're going to keep him, I think, even through the summertime. It doesn't make any sense right now because, like you said, Dostal may get 7 or 8 games. We've got 16, 17 games left, something like that. So if he gets an even split. But you're right. If he's not considered number one material, the only exception to this, and you and I did talk about this before we recorded, is if you trade Gibson to a team that you're going to get a number one goalie back in return. Some kind of, blockbuster deal like that. I mean, otherwise, if you're going to trade Gibson and get a bunch of players and a bunch of picks and everything like that, and no goalie in return, then you're going to have to figure out what are you going to do. And then you have Stolarz, who's hurt. He's done it. He's done for the season. Do they bring him back? We don't know. I think ideally you have Dostal be the backup to Gibson next season. Have Gibson mentor him. If he gets to where Verbeek is comfortable with him taking over, then that's when you pull the trigger. Like I said, I think the only exception, Thomas, is if somehow a number one goalie is, Gibson for another, number one comes some kind of, big deal. I don't know if that happens, but from what Verbeek is saying and when I saw there in him talking, that's the feeling I got.
Yeah, I agree. I also think there's one other exception to trade Gibson is if you can get Chicago or Columbus's first round pick. You trade Gibson in that case also. But that's not going to happen.
But that is a good point. I mean, I didn't even think about that. We didn't talk about that. That is a good point. I mean, if the Ducks have been winning games now, more so than losing lately. They've not been playing great, but they've been winning more games, getting more points, moving a little bit up from the bottom. Not a whole lot, but you're right. If the Ducks end up 4th or 5th, from the bottom or whatnot, then do they really want Bedard or is there someone else? Maybe there is some kind of something that can happen there. So that's another thing to watch. That's an interesting point you bring up that, hey, where do the Ducks end up at the end of the season? If they're not in that top 3, could that happen? I mean, I don't think it would, like you said. I think those teams would hang on to their picks, but I don't know. Summer could be crazy. Something to think about, Thomas.
Yeah, it'd be shocking if it did. I'd be so happy if it did. No offense to Gibson, but at this point, young offensive talent is what the Ducks need, and there are 4 prospects in this draft who in any given year would probably be first overall. But because all 4 in the same draft, only one gets to be, and that's going to be Bedard. But then the other 3, Carlson, Fantilli, and Michkov, they'll be 2, 3, 4 in some order. And if you can get one of those players, you're going to be very, very happy in June.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I'll kind of skip one part. I guess that's what Verbeek did talk about in the draft too. They asked him what he thought about the picks. And he's like, hey, there's, the potential to have 3 great top picks. They can help the team as well. Maybe even a few after that. So that kind of goes towards the notion of, hey, like you said, any one of these guys would be a number one maybe in a draft that isn't as fully loaded. So that's another thing to consider too, is maybe you hang on. If they're second or third, I think they hang on and get that pick as well. So interesting times, to see what will happen. I thought I did like talking about the state of the team now. I did like Verbeek's thoughts. He was asked straight up. Hayward said, hey, rebuilds take 5 to 6 years. Verbeek said they're a few years into it. He said, you have to, remain patient. But he wasn't really happy with the overall performance of the team. He thought that they would have a better record. He didn't like their, quote, compete level early in the season. But he does like what he's seen as of lately. So I think that's a fair assessment of the team. I think that's an honest assessment, and it's refreshing to hear that, Thomas.
Yeah, like before the season, I did not expect the Ducks to make the playoffs, but I did not expect them to be in the running for Bedard. I thought it'd be like last year, finish with a 10th worst record, maybe a little better than that, hopefully a little better than that. But the wheels just fell off immediately, and they've only slightly recovered relatively recently. But obviously far too late to have any hope of this season. But yeah, I thought they would be not so much better than they had been, but I thought they would be better than they have shown this year. And sometimes that happens. Sometimes just a team is bad when they shouldn't be, and sometimes a team is really good when they shouldn't be. That's sports for you, right? Just expect the unexpected.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think at the beginning of the season, we didn't think that they were going to be a playoff team. We knew it was going to be a rough year, but we didn't think it was going to be this rough. I mean, it's really, if you're a Ducks fan, it's been a tough season. You're really suffering with the way stuff has gone. We've had obviously that last great goal by Zegras between the legs.
Oh yeah, that was something else.
That was fantastic. Of course, it was on ESPN again, just like the goal or I should say the pass to Milano against Buffalo, also on ESPN. So you've seen stuff like that this season. You've seen Troy Terry tear it up. And doing well, not scoring as much, but he's still been playing well. McTavish as well. So there's things that there are positives from the season, but you're right. I knew it wasn't going to be a playoff year, but man, I didn't think that they would be in the running for the top pick either. I think you hit the nail on the head there. So that's where Verbeek was not happy, and I think he's right. The big thing was the compete level. It felt like, after a certain point this season, that losing was okay almost. And I know that that's not what the players feel, but it just seems like they got in some ruts there where, hey, we lost again tonight. Okay, on to the next one, and whatnot. Not that they accepted losing, but it just felt like maybe the passion wasn't there as much. I don't know. That's just kind of my read once we got kind of halfway through the season, Thomas.
Yeah, it's hard to get up for a game in February against another bad team when you're a bad team, right? So I get it, but yeah, hopefully they're better next year. Hopefully it starts turning around.
Now, this was also another part that was interesting. He talked about the coaching staff. He was hit up about that at the event, and he said he wasn't going to make a decision on any of the coaches until the 82-game season had been completed. Then he would go through and evaluate all the coaching staff. A lot of people during the season had asked for Dallas Eakins to be removed, to bring in someone else, which I still never thought that was the right move, just because if you remove him just to remove him, then what's the point? I mean, if you had someone you knew that was going to be your long-term guy and you wanted to bring him in, maybe I could see it. But what did you think about Eakins and how he did the season? Do you think Verbeek waiting till the season's over, do you think that's a good call or not? What's your take on that?
I think for Eakins, well, first I want to say, as a human being, I really like Eakins a lot. But as a coach in the NHL, he's lacking. In the AHL, he's actually a very good coach. He was great with the goals, and that's actually why I was initially excited when the Ducks brought him up to the NHL. I thought, he might not be a great choice or the perfect choice, but he's put the time in with San Diego that he's earned this chance. Unfortunately, that chance has obviously not gone very well in his time here. I think if you were going to fire Eakins and try and turn things around, it's one of two things. It's either early in the season to try and turn the season around and get things back on track. That didn't happen. Or like you said, you've got someone in mind who you want to come in. And you know what? If you really do have someone in mind who you want right now, you may as well let them come in now and start putting the system in place. So it's a little easier for next year's returning players to be used to it. So the fact that Verbeek is not going to do that tells me he doesn't have someone he desperately wants right now, or if there is someone he really wants, maybe they're an assistant somewhere else and therefore can't get them until the off season at the earliest. So I think since Eakins wasn't fired the first month or two of the season, I'm perfectly fine having him right out the rest of the year. And like we said, I don't think the last time I was on, but the time before, he's done a good job with McTavish, Terry, and Zegras, and that's the most important thing for the Ducks right now, is are your young players improving overall? And he's pretty good with them. As long as their game didn't just, go in the toilet completely, I felt Aikens was going to be safe in the role. And have they progressed exponentially every single game? Obviously not. That doesn't happen in hockey with pretty much anyone, but has their game improved from last season to this season? Overall, I think the answer is yes. So I'm okay with Aikens doing that, staying in, because he is helping those three players improve. The thing that really sucks is Drysdale's not getting that this year, so we'll see what happens with him. But at least for McTavish, Terry, and Zegras, I think we have seen improvement from them. So keeping Aikens makes sense, especially at this point in the year. Firing someone with 10, 15 games less than the season makes no sense unless they have done something awful, frankly, that is not related to what's going on the ice, or they ask to be let go. Other than that, it doesn't make sense to trade someone right now, unless you're Lou Lamoriello, who does that every now and then because he's kind of weird. But Verbeek is not Lamoriello, as far as I know.
Nice point. Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, he's going to ride out the rest of the season. And, he touched on McTavish, Terry, and Zegras. Verbeek did talk about them and the strides that they made this season. He had some interesting points. He talked about McTavish taking big steps. Thought he improved defensively. Thinks he can only get better being so young. He likes what he's seeing in Terry as well. He thinks a concern with Terry is being able to go up against the top defenseman of another team. So he thinks that it was interesting. A lot of the discussion, even Niedermayer too at this event, they were talking about the gym, getting the players in the gym, lifting the weights, and strength and conditioning. Conditioning, I get it, but a lot of emphasis on the strength of the players at this season ticket holder event. I just thought that was key, and he was saying that same thing with Zegras, great on offense, but he needs to work on his defensive game. So he was talking about these guys and going up, these guys are the core, they're the future of the team, but they're going to have to work on a few things because they're going to go up against the best players defensively of all the other teams, because it's no secret now, right? Everybody knows about Zegras. Everybody knows about Terry and McTavish. There's nothing, you're not gonna sneak them into a game and surprise anybody. They know that these guys can score. They know that these guys can make moves. And I just thought it was very interesting. He was talking about strength. That was a big thing he wanted to see with his guys. And then he also said that he would be looking at their contracts in the off season. He didn't want to worry about it during the season. That includes Drysdale as well, as you mentioned. Unfortunately, was not able to play most of the season. He also mentioned Drysdale talking about how he will be ready in 3 or 4 weeks, but maybe he's at practice, maybe he doesn't play the rest of the season. We're here in like the final month or so of the season, so I don't know that we'll see him as well. But interesting thoughts there. Very, very big emphasis on the fact that they're going to have to go up against the best defensemen against other teams moving forward, Thomas.
Yeah, if you're going to take on Victor Hedman, you have to be strong enough to take on Victor Hedman. So I get it. And for a lot of these players, Zegras is still, 21, 22. McTavish just turned 20.
Mm-hmm.
These are kids still, practically.
Yes.
God, that make me feel so old. So I get it. They, especially for Zegras coming through the college, right? In his one season of NCAA hockey, he played 30-something games at Boston. Playing 70, 80 games in the NHL is a huge step up from playing 30 games of college hockey. So just, there's such a different mindset to that. So they do need to get stronger, I agree. And that's what the offseason is for. Hopefully they will come back to training camp, not with 30 pounds more muscle, because they're going to be a lot slower, but 5, 10, 15 pounds more muscle, just be that much stronger, that much able to take care of themselves, hold on to the puck when they're going against the Victor Hedmans of the world.
Yeah, and the good news too, this was something else that was brought up during this event, which I thought was interesting, was Verbeek talked about when he interviewed for the position, he talked to the owners about spending money up to the cap, which obviously there's some stuff that's got to get figured out at the end of the season. We've got some UFAs, we've got some RFAs, we got things that got to get figured out. The Ducks are well below it, but it was interesting that he asked the Samuelis, like, hey, if I need to spend up to the cap, is that okay? And they said yes. So I was like, oh, okay, that's kind of cool, because that's been one criticism that a lot of people have had of the Ducks, is that we don't recently seem to spend up to the cap. So I'm curious to see how the rebuild goes if we're a couple years into it, right? We got to get these guys figured out for these contracts. Obviously, some of them, McTavish, Terry, Zegras, Drysdale should get some decent deals and then have some room for some other players and whatnot. I'm very, very curious to see what happens, next season after these deals are all ironed out, where the cap space is at and whatnot, and to see where they go. But I was happy to hear that the owners are giving him, that leeway, because it's not to criticize Murray, but it just seemed like he was always penny pinching. We used to laugh about the bargain bin, deals that Bob would make and all that kind of stuff like that. So I thought that was a little interesting nugget that was brought up during this, Thomas, because to me it makes me hopeful that maybe there will be a big splash or something in the next maybe year or so.
Yeah, you want to be able to spend the cap, but when it makes sense, like this year for the Ducks, it doesn't make sense to spend the cap because we knew they were going to be bad.
Right.
Do you know who is the second highest cap hit in the league right now?
No.
Montreal. Montreal is one of the worst teams in the league. Now, part of that is because Carey Price is making, I think it's $10.5 million, and he's obviously not playing, unfortunately. So they've got some big money players who are injured. That's one of the reasons why it's so high. But you don't want to be in a position where you're bad and have a really, really high cap hit. If you have that cap hit, you want to be Vegas, Edmonton, Tampa. You want to be going for the cup, or at least in the playoff conversation.
Yes.
That's not Montreal this year. Again, injuries happen, and that can change that significantly. But I'm happy that the Ducks will spend the cap when they need to. And, they were used with Burke, they were used with Murray, where they would spend, maybe not exactly to the cap, but get relatively close to it when they felt they had a chance. And then at the years when it didn't make sense, they wouldn't do it. And I think that's the right way to do business, because if you spend the cap every year, at some point, things get really bad, and that's when you usually have to do the rebuild. And that's what's happened with the Ducks. They were too close to the cap. They didn't have a lot of flexibility on their contracts, and they weren't good enough, and they kind of had to wait some of those bad contracts out. And that's why one of the reasons why Verbeek traded Lindholm last year. He did offer Lindholm a contract. I think it was 5 years. Lindholm didn't want that. He wanted the 8-year deal. And you know what, Hampus Lindholm, good for you that you got that in Boston. But I miss him a lot. A part of me is happy Verbeek didn't sign Lindholm to 8 years, because when you sign a player who's in their late 20s or early 30s to that 8-year deal, that can really trap you. If their play goes down, 5, 6, 7 years into it, that can really hamper a team. I hate to say it, we saw it with Perry. His last couple of years weren't very good, and that's why Murray ended up buying him out. If Perry's contract had been for 5 or 6 years rather than 8 years, then that issue probably doesn't happen, because his decline matches when his contract ends, rather than being still paid so much for a few more seasons. So I'm glad that Verbeek is going to be allowed to play to spend the cap, but I also think he's going to be smart and not just throw out 8-year deals left and right the way some teams do, because that's how you get into trouble with the cap. If you want to give an 8-year deal to Zegras and Terry, Zegras absolutely. Terry, a little leery because he's on the wrong side of 25, but I would get it. But just don't be giving an 8-year deal to someone like, say, Ryan Strome. 5-year deal, even that's a little long, but for a free agent, 5 years is actually not too bad.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm not a big fan of the long-term deals like you were talking about, the 7-8-year deals. Like you said, if it's someone that's a 20-year-old, 21-year-old that's Zegras, then of course. But when you have those guys in the late 20s, early 30s, it makes me nervous. And I'm with you. And that was a sticking point with Lindholm. You're exactly right. That's why that didn't work out. So I do think, like you said, I think Verbeek, even though he can spin to it, he's going to be wise about it. And yes, it did not make sense this season to go up to it. Next year, we'll see. Maybe, depends on how all the, what happens in summer, how the deals all iron out and whatnot. But I am glad that at least he has, options basically, and the owners are giving that to him. So that's a positive sign. One other thing that I thought was interesting too in this Q&A session was about tanking. I thought it was funny because Brian Hayward brought it up and asked Verbeek straight up, about the draft, about getting a high pick. And he even mentioned, it was kind of funny because he kind of hesitated. He kind of, under his breath, was like, I don't want to talk about losing on purpose, but, and it came up, and I thought it was very, very interesting because Verbeek, as I talked about before, was talking about the top 3 picks, how they all helped this team and everything. And I thought it was interesting. I like his mindset. He said, quote, "We are here to win. So are the players. It's their careers. They're fighting for jobs, and I don't want to take that away from them." So he also alluded to that with the coaches as well. So I was glad to hear that. I know a lot of people on social media, you might not be happy with all your tanking gifts and whatnot, but I thought that was a key. Alexis Downey, I interviewed her, and she talked about that too as well. If you didn't hear that podcast, it's a couple shows back, and she said the same thing. So I think part of the rebuild that maybe we don't talk about, we're always like, oh, let's trade this player, let's spend up to the cap, let's get this guy or that guy. But another part of it is the mindset. And from what I saw at that event, I like Verbeek's mindset. He wants these guys working out, focusing on their game, getting better. He doesn't want them worrying about, okay, let's get a high draft pick. I don't know. I just felt like overall from this whole thing that his attitude is a culture of trying to make the players better and bring in a culture of winning. Obviously, this season it didn't happen, but we're in a rebuild. We're in the second or third year. I'm really curious to see what happens next year. Maybe we're not a contending team. Maybe we don't make the playoffs next year either. But I want to see how much that we improve next year, and then the year after that is where I'm really key to see what happens. Thomas.
Yeah, I like that quote from Verbeek a lot because as fans, we can kind of step back, and a player's career, it's their career, but to us, it's just, what can you do for my team? And if you want your team to be bad to tank, you don't want them to do so well. But this is their livelihood, and there are some, let's say Connor McDavid, for example, he's going to make so much money, he's never going to have to worry about money the rest of his life. But for most teams that are bad, it's not filled with players like Connor McDavid. It's filled with players who are making league minimum, a little more than league minimum, which granted, that's more than I'm ever going to make in my entire life in a year. But a lot of their careers aren't necessarily incredibly long careers. They're in the NHL for 3, 4, 5 years. And after that, they've got to figure out what to do next. Hopefully invest their money wisely. Some do, some don't. So I really like that Verbeek is essentially looking after the players and saying, hey, I'm not going to make things worse for them. But on the other hand, this is the only year I'm kind of like, I hate tanking. I'm against tanking. Because of the number of players who would be first overall in any other year, this is the one year where I'm like, okay, I'm kind of on board with tanking. To me, Bedard is not the goal. Getting the first overall pick cannot be the goal because you've got I think it's a 1 in 4 chance approximately if you finish last overall. Those are terrible odds. Bedard for the first overall pick cannot be the goal. That's the hope. But in a draft like this, if you want to say a top 4 pick is the goal, I'm okay with that, but only in a year like this. Most years are not like this. Last year, I don't want to tank. The year before, I don't want to tank. The year before, I don't want to tank. Only because there are 4 such studs this year. I'm like, okay, if we tank, we tank. Like, we all know how good Bedard is. If you watch the World Juniors, he was just dominant. Fantilli's putting together one of the best freshman seasons ever. Carlson in the SHL, I don't follow him as closely, but to my understanding, he's putting together one of the best U18 seasons in a very long time. And then Michkov in Russia, I've seen him compared to Kucherov. I've seen him called the best Russian prospect since Ovechkin. I mean, if you can get any of those players, you are very, very happy. So Bedard, first overall pick, that's not the goal, that's the hope. A top 4 pick for one of these players, though, that to me really is the goal in a year like this. But at the same time, this is about the player's career, the players who are on the ice right now. And the worse they are, the harder it's going to be for some of them. Like, let's take a look at Derek Grant. Next year, is he going to be the NHL? I don't know if he will because this season's gone miserably for him, especially because of how much time he's missed. Like, someone might not offer him a contract. Maybe he's in the AHL for significantly less money. Maybe he goes overseas to continue his career. Maybe he stays with the Ducks because that is his happy place, it seems like. But, him finding a job next year is going to be that much harder because of how bad things have gone for him this year. If the Ducks actually play not 500 hockey because they'd be better than they have been this season. But if they played a little better this year, Grant put up some better numbers, then there's no question he's going to get a deal this summer. But it's the players like him who Verbeek is talking about when he's saying it's their careers. He wants to make sure that they still have a chance this summer to keep playing if they want to.
No, you make some good points there. I think the big thing in there that you talked about is, the whole thing about tanking. You and I are in the same boat. Like, you don't want to lose, on purpose and whatnot. And yes, the last couple seasons, you really didn't want to tank. But you do look at this season, and Verbeek did talk about in this event that, hey, you got 4 or 5, the top picks there that are going to be players that are going to help a team out anyways. So, hey, if we finish, in that group, that you're fine. And another thing, too, you brought up another thing that people forget, too, is just because you finish worse than the league doesn't guarantee you the first pick. It is. It's like a 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 chance. It's something like that. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's not an automatic. So even though you're the worst, doesn't mean you get the first, pick. So that's another thing to consider as well with this team. But I think the other part of this equation too is defensively. We'll kind of wrap up the show here. We have a couple questions about this, and we'll finish it off. But for this team, and a lot of people harp on this because they've talked about Dostal and that. They talked about Stolarz, Gibson, and the defense has not been there. They did touch on Zellweger, Mentakulov, and Hines for the Ducks next year. They said Lacombe is going to come to Anaheim after he's done with college this year. And it kind of leads to a question of Tim Coffin. He asked, what guys may be brought up to the AHL. I don't know if anybody's going to be brought up, but as far as next season, I think this is something that we should look forward to, Thomas. I don't know if any of these guys are going to be a regular starter in the team, but if you do want to take away a positive from this, you look at the Ducks, draft picks and players coming up in the pipeline defensively. The Ducks are loaded with talent, which kind of goes back to maybe why Theron also didn't sign with the Ducks, because he maybe saw this and was like, man, it's a crowded blue line coming up for the Ducks from the minors. What do you think about those guys? You think we may see some of those guys next season?
So I think you're right about Throne. I think he looked at it and said, okay, there's a lot of competition. Let's see where else I can go. I think he was one of the better ones, not the best. I think Zellweger and Mintyukov are a step above everyone else in the Anaheim system. But after them, I think Throne had an argument to be the third or fourth best defensive prospect. But the gap was not large, I would say. Hines has had a great season. Lacombe has been very good. He's been, I believe, he's been nominated for the Hoppy Baker this year. So I'm very excited to see what they're going to do next year. Next year, Zellweger he's turning pro. There's no question of that. I think we will see him in the AHL with the Ducks. We're also going to see him with the goals because most young players, but defensemen especially, need a little time in the AHL. Hines is also turning pro. He's definitely going to start with the goals before getting a shot with the Ducks. Lacombe, like Verbeek said, he will be with the Ducks this year to finish things out, and we'll see how he does in that time. I think next year, it's kind of like Troy Terry, where he signed with the Ducks when his college career was over. He played a few games to end the season, and then the season after that, he was in both the AHL and NHL. So I think that's going to happen to Lacombe next year as well. We're going to see him in both places. Mintyukov is the interesting one for me. So I can't figure out exactly why, but I've seen people saying that he is actually AHL eligible next year. But his birthday is not until, I think, November, and he's only played 3 seasons of junior hockey in Canada. And I think to be eligible for the AHL, you have to be either already 20 or played 4 seasons of junior hockey. So maybe they're counting his season of Russian junior hockey in that as why he's eligible. But if he is, I would love to see him with the goals. He and Zellweger they both look fantastic. If Mintyukov is not eligible for San Diego, I do think he will make his NHL debut at the start of the season and then get that 8 or 9 game tryout before the Ducks decide exactly what to do with him, if it's back to juniors or stay with him. Or maybe he's NHL eligible and I'm just misreading the rules and I can't figure it out right now. We'll see what happens with that. But both of them I'm very excited for. I'm excited for all 4 of these players to see what they can do next year. Also in San Diego, even though he hasn't had a great season, we do have Drew Helleson, who we got from Colorado last year, but no one's had a great season in San Diego, so that's not saying much. He's still an exciting player to watch. And unlike all the players I just listed, he's also a right-handed shooter, so he's someone else to keep an eye on. I think we'll see most of them at some point next year. I don't know how much. This year, I thought we'd see Hellison. I thought we'd see Perot. I thought we'd see Tracy. I thought we'd see Grew, and none of them have been here. So this season's gone not as expected in terms of AHL call-ups. So it's hard to guess for next year, but I do think we'll see most of them at some point with the Ducks.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. The season hasn't gone according to plan. So trying to see any of these guys towards the end, it kind of seems like they're going to try and ride it out and figure it out. Justin Stevens asked about, what do the D pairings look like for next season? I think it's a really, really hard question because the Ducks blue line is the biggest question mark for this team, really, in my opinion. You have Fowler that's signed, obviously, for a couple more seasons. You have Colton White that's coming back in there, and then you've got Vakanainen as well. And then after that, it's like a free-for-all. They still got to figure out what they're going to do with Shattenkirk. You've got Beaulieu. You've got Harrington as well. They've got to figure this stuff out. So you don't, and obviously Drysdale will be back. So it's tough to look at the Ducks blue line next season, predict what it is. I would like to think that Vakanainen would come back and Benoit as well. And maybe you have Benoit and Drysdale, Vakanainen and Shattenkirk were together. And then Fowler and somebody, I don't know. It's just tough. And like you said, you've got those other guys in the rules. I'm not 100% on all those rules either. They confuse me. I usually defer to you when I ask about the minor league stuff because I know you tend to know it better than I do. But that's the one thing that I think will really dictate next season. If they don't bring back Stolars, they ride with Dostal and Gibson in net. What is that blue line going to look like? And I think it's too early to tell. I really can't say because there's so many players that we don't even know if they're coming back next season, Thomas.
Yeah, most of the Ducks blue line right now, it's not good. Honestly, looking at this blue line, Cam Fowler, he's one of my favorite players. He's at this point in his career, I think, a second pairing player. He's miscast on the Ducks top line or top pairing, but there's no one else to be there. Everyone else to me, though, the Ducks have, who is healthy, so I'm not including Drysdale, are a third pairing player, like Shattenkirk's a third pairing player, or they're that seventh defenseman, or should be in the AHL even. So the Ducks defense is just, frankly, not very good. It needs to be completely overhauled, and I think they need to start this summer. Fowler will be back. If they want to bring back Shattenkirk as a veteran presence as a 6th D-man, great, fine. If they want Beaulieu or White as that 7th, 8th guy, or even the call from San Diego, fine. If they want Benoit for that role or Harrington for that role, I'm fine with any of that. But you can't have all of them come back. You need to rework the defense, and to do that, you've got to make either trades or free agency. And this summer's defensive free agency crop, it's not great, but there are a couple players who are really interesting to me. Ideally, the one I would actually want is Matt Dumba. He hasn't been great at Minnesota the last couple of years, but he's a right-hand shooting defenseman. He can play over 20 minutes a night. You get him for your second pairing, that's going to help a lot, I feel like. Because the Ducks have a lot of left pairing defensemen. They need right-handers. So I think Dumba would be a good one, but he's also one of the few on the market, so he's going to be in demand. We're obviously not going to bring back Klingberg. That experiment did not work, unfortunately. Looking at the free agency list, Eric Johnson, he's 35 right now. I think that's too old to even think about. Shane Gostisbehere can play left or right, so he's one they could consider bringing in. Damon Severson. And then the next one on the list is Kevin Shattenkirk. So there's not a ton in the free agency market, so that's why I think Dumba makes a lot of sense. It's that or a trade, I feel like. Or you have players who usually play on the left-hand side, playing on the right-hand side, and some can do that really well. I think actually, Lacombe, if I remember correctly, he's a left-hand. He plays on the left side, but he can play right as well. So that ability to play both sides can really help him going forward. But yeah, the free agency is not great, but I think they have to get at least one, if not two, free agent defensemen this summer.
Yeah, you made a good point there. If you look at Fowler and Drysdale, the drop off after that is actually pretty huge. You're looking at those two guys, and then you got Harrington, White, Beaulieu, Benoit, Vakanainen, Shattenkirk, Schuster. These are guys that you're talking about 5th, 6th, 7th, maybe even 8th defensemen. These aren't guys that are going to be top four material, and you're right, you can't bring them all back. So I think going into this summer, obviously we'll finish out the season, see how the Ducks do. We know they're not going to make the playoffs. Obviously, they're going to try and be somewhere in the high draft pick area. And then the goal, I think, is trying to improve the blue line in the summer. And then, like you said, maybe there's a deal for Gibson somewhere in there. If it's another first round pick that they're trying to get, if they actually play really well during the rest of the season, or maybe there's another number one goalie they're trying to get out there or whatnot. But I think that's what the Ducks got to look for is somehow improving the blue line, because no matter if it's Dostal or Gibson, Stoll, or whoever's in net, it doesn't matter. You and me in net. I mean, it's going to be rough.
Like Verbeek last year, a year ago, he started trading away defensemen, and then over the summer, he really only, other than Klingberg, really brought in forwards. He did bring in Kulikov as well, but I feel like it's the forwards he's done a better job with than the defense. And the two defensemen he's brought in, Kulikov and Klingberg, neither worked out. Granted, Kulikov we didn't expect a ton from. Klingberg had the big expectations, didn't work. His forwards, they've been Vetrano, Strom. They haven't been great, but they've been better. And also, I think less was expected of them. Like, to me, neither was supposed to be that top player the way Klingberg was supposed to be. They're more complementary scorers. Like, I think Vetrano, he shouldn't be on the second line. He's a great third-line winger. Strom should be on the second line, who could play on the top line as needed, but really should be on that second line. So I think I like who he brought up forward. Let's see what he can bring in for defense this summer, and hopefully they work out better than Klingberg and Kulikov did last year.
All right, that'll wrap it up. Some great points that you brought up on this show. We covered the trade deadline before, we covered it after. Now we'll ride out the rest of the season. Probably I don't know if we'll do another show before the end of the season. We'll definitely have one. When it does end, we'll figure that all out. But in the meantime, thank you for your support. Check us out on DucksNPucks.com. We're also on Patreon.com/DucksNPucks. And as always, let's go Ducks.